Socialist candidate Zohran Mamdani has pulled off what has been called the biggest upset in modern political history in the New York City Democratic mayoral election. Running on a platform of free buses, free childcare, building city-run grocery stores, and freezing the rent in rent-stabilized apartments, Mamdani defied the odds and defeated former Governor Andrew Cuomo and guardian angel Curtis Sliwa. He defeated Cuomo in both the primary and the general election, earning over 50% of the votes, more than both of his opponents combined. As the New York Times noted, Cuomo had formidable advantages. He had, quote, almost universal name recognition and was leading in the polls before he even entered the contest. A pro-Cuomo super PAC with $25 million shattered campaign spending records during the primary, and both Republican and Democratic billionaires did everything they could to ensure that Cuomo would prevail. Mamdani has showed here the viability of the kind of program that leftists have been arguing for since Bernie Sanders ran in 2016. Uncompromisingly bold, committed to social democratic policies, focused on economic issues without sacrificing a concern for racial or gender justice, pro-labor, anti-fascist, and delivered in plain language with humor, warmth, and solidarity. I actually interviewed Zohran Mamdani last year for this program, and he returned consistently to the concern of New Yorkers that they couldn't afford groceries and that they couldn't afford their rent. He presented an uplifting vision of New York becoming the city that it was always meant to be.
Which is a place that working people can flourish, that working people can dream of more than simply getting off the wheel to go to sleep and getting back on the hamster wheel in the morning to go back to work. Because what we have right now is a crisis where the people who've built this city, who sustain this city, are the ones who are being pushed out of this city, all while we are concerned about this imaginary flight of the wealthy from New York City when it's in fact the working class who are leaving this place that we call home. And what a Mamdani mayorality would look like is spending each and every day figuring out how we could make this city more affordable and how we could bring a shred of dignity back into the working class's life on a 24-hour basis, on and on and on.
Zohran Mamdani, throughout this campaign, combined a brilliant video strategy, and credit there goes to his incredibly skilled team, including the experienced filmmakers Olivia Becker and Donald Borenstein. They combined that with a massive on-the-ground organizing operation, which aimed to break records for door-knocking in the city. So the message discipline he had, the charisma, the organization, now all of that was enough to impress even the crusty Democratic strategist James Carville, who praised Mamdani's operation. Now when he came on the program recently, David Sirota of The Lever also pointed out another factor to current affairs. He said that Mamdani benefited hugely from New York City's generous public financing law for elections, which allowed him to focus on organizing instead of fundraising. And actually, Mamdani himself pointed out that advantage when we interviewed him.
There are a number of things that give us a pathway to winning. And one of them is the fact that in New York City, there's a public matching system. So if you are a New York City resident and you give anywhere between $10 to $250 to a candidate running for mayor, the city will match that 8 times. And so a $250 donation then becomes north of $2,000 in terms of its worth for a campaign. And what that means is if you raise around $1 million, you will then get an additional, about 7 million or so from the city, enabling you to run an $8 million campaign. And I think
that's kind of crazy. That's wild. I mean, that's cool, but how did that happen? That's awesome.
The idea of it is to empower small dollar donors. The idea of it is to take on the very kinds of special interests you're talking about. I think it's the kind of thing that would be very difficult to pass today, but I'm glad that it does exist.
Now, meanwhile, Andrew Cuomo was sour, joyless, and a perfect punching bag. Cuomo embodied everything that people dislike about American politics. He was corrupt, dishonest, and abusive. So it kind of helped Mamdani in both the primary and the general election, that his chief opponent is cartoonishly loathsome in this way. A serial sexual harasser who seemed to radiate contempt for the very city that he was running to be mayor of. Cuomo's slogan throughout the race might as well have been, "Fuck you all, I deserve to rule over you, I hate your city." He made quite an excellent foil for an anti-elitist, anti-oligarchy campaign. Mamdani couldn't really have asked for a better out-of-touch rich man to run against. Cuomo actually argued at one point in the race that Mamdani's $2,300 a month rent for his one-bedroom apartment, which is rent stabilized, wasn't actually expensive enough. It seems quite a lot to me. If the establishment in this race had lined up behind a slick, Obama-esque centrist who seemed maybe to actually like New York City, Mamdani would have faced a much more difficult fight, but they didn't do that. And there was very little enthusiasm for Andrew Cuomo's candidacy. So if you want to run an insurgent, anti-establishment campaign of the kind that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez famously ran against the now completely forgotten Joe Crowley, you really need, or at least could benefit from, an opponent like Andrew Cuomo or Crowley, someone who embodies all the terrible things about the political establishment. But let's not overstate the role of luck in the opponent he got, because Zohran Mamdani is also just really, really good at this. He's good at this in a way that I've been desperately hoping a left politician would be for some time. And only Bernie Sanders seems really to be able to pull off. When you see Zohran Mamdani speak, all of these smears against him in the AI videos that Andrew Cuomo put out, for instance, all these smears start to seem ridiculous because Mamdani is very likable, compassionate, and sincere. And it's obvious that he's not what he's being accused of. He's not an anti-Semite, he's just pro-Palestine. And in fact, he's eloquent and he's empathetic in condemning anti-Semitism. Now, he's also pretty pragmatic about his socialist commitments. He understands, like the famous sewer socialists of the early part of the 20th century, including the famous socialist mayor of Milwaukee, who was in office for over 20 years, that a left administration must first and foremost deliver good governance that actually makes people understand, believe that he is fighting for them, that he is trying to take care of their basic needs. And I think Zohran Mamdani has learned from Franklin Roosevelt and also from the failures of Joe Biden that effective politics demands communicating with people directly, showing them that you understand what they're going through, and explaining to them very clearly what you're doing to fix it. His victory speech was full of pledges for what he was actually going to deliver and how it was going to make a difference in people's lives and having government that people can trust and believe in again. He talks about making government work more efficiently and effectively, not just embodying the ideological aspirations of socialism. And actually, that's what gives me a bit of hope that he's actually going to, despite his inexperience, which is often noted, be a pretty effective mayor if he does follow through on what he's saying. I think he might be actually a more skilled administrator than people expect, because if you listen closely to what he's saying, he talks a lot about running a competent administration, getting really, really skilled experts, and his transition team looks pretty good. The other thing I like about Mamdani, though, is he doesn't back down. He's pragmatic, but he's also principled. Now, the pragmatism element means, for example, he's not proposing to nationalize, or I guess municipalize, all of the grocery stores in New York, but he's talking about trying a pilot program of 5 city-run grocery stores in food deserts, and he's going to see how it goes. If it doesn't go well, he says the program wouldn't continue. People have characterized that as free groceries, but it's actually a pretty modest program. And that kind of pragmatism means being sensitive to political realities, but it doesn't mean bending on core principles. Now, I was pretty encouraged throughout the campaign by the way that Mamdani consistently resisted pressure to disavow the pro-Palestine movement, for instance. He hasn't gone the way of some progressive politicians and shied away from confrontation with the powerful. His victory speech was highly confrontational, talking about landlords and billionaires and Donald Trump. He understands that people right now want to see a fighter, someone standing up for them. That victory speech, it was full of joy, but it was full of fire. It honored the contributions of his campaign workers, but also promised that there was going to be a fight ahead, and it named the enemy.
If anyone can show a nation betrayed by Donald Trump how to defeat him, it is the city that gave rise to him. And if there is any way to terrify a despot, it is by dismantling the very conditions that allowed him to accumulate power. This is not only how we stop Trump, it's how we stop the next one. So Donald Trump, since I know you're watching, I have 4 words for you. Turn the volume up.
Now, watching Mamdani's rise has been a strange experience for me because about a year ago, Current Affairs ran that interview with him, which we entitled, "Could a Democratic Socialist Mayor Be Just What New York City Needs?" Now, of course, as a socialist myself, I personally thought the answer to that question was yes, it is exactly what New York City needs. But I'm under no illusions about the difficulties that leftists face in American politics. Mamdani's campaign, as I think he himself would acknowledge back then, was a huge long shot, and other than Current Affairs, just about the only publications covering his campaign back then were Democracy Now! And Jacobin magazine. Now, when we spoke here on Current Affairs, I was very impressed with Mamdani. He was relentlessly on message, coming back constantly to his affordability pitch. He was so good at that when someone asked him about the Kendrick Lamar-Drake feud, he managed to pivot his answer back to affordability. And when we spoke, he gave clear, concise answers that spoke to the basic material needs of New Yorkers. But I've had my fair share of excitement followed by crushing disappointment in my time watching American politics. For example, the 2 heartbreaking Bernie Sanders campaigns in 2016 and 2020, or Abdul El-Sayed's 2018 gubernatorial race in Michigan. So after we turned the tape off from that interview, I actually asked Mamdani, I told him, I've been disappointed so many times. I worried this was a protest run or run to make a point. I asked him to promise me that if he was going to run and get people like me excited, he wasn't going to be running a protest campaign, but would actually win, run to win. I remember specifically asking him, can you just go and win this thing, please? And he laughed and he promised me that he would go and win, which at the time was quite implausible. But then he did. He went and won. And I watched as this guy who I was talking to, who seemingly had no chance, went and won the thing just like he said he was going to. And I realized it's probably not the case that after that interview, he got off the Zoom call and said to himself that day, well, if Nathan Robinson and Current Affairs say I should actually go out and win the election, maybe I should reconsider and go out and actually try and win it. But his victory has still been a bit surreal, given that when he did confidently tell me he was going to succeed, it seemed so incredibly unlikely. And I did get to watch over the months as all these different pieces fell into place steadily one by one as he started putting together a campaign that is so good that even his sworn enemies now have to admit, as Gerard Baker of the Wall Street Journal did in the op-ed page there, that, quote, Mamdani did a better job of speaking to voters' concerns about their living standards in a city in which what were once basic aspirations, like a well-paying job and a decent home to live in, have become unrealizable fantasies for many. I actually spent a week in New York City recently, and I saw firsthand a bit of the Mamdani magic. There was the massive rally while I was there with Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in Queens, and more than 10,000 people showed up to that, which is a huge number for a mayoral election event in a non-presidential year. That was so packed that I couldn't even get a ticket into it. But I did manage to squeeze into a midnight press conference the following Thursday that Mamdani was giving alongside taxi drivers and nurses. And there he was speaking about the struggles facing working class people who work the night shift. And I think they actually scheduled the press conference for midnight so that they could drag journalists out and basically give them a taste of what it's like to have to be out working at midnight like all of the taxi drivers. Now, during that press conference, I was able to ask Mamdani to respond to Vice President J.D. Vance, who had just basically attacked non-English speakers and said it's okay for Americans to want neighbors who don't speak different languages from them. I asked him about that, and I got Mamdani to give a pretty moving response.
Vice President J.D. Vance just said he thinks it's okay if Americans don't want neighbors who speak different languages than them recently.
I don't know these people. They don't speak the same language that I do. And because there are 20 in the house next door, it's a little bit rowdier than it was when there was just a family of 4, a family of 5. It is totally reasonable and acceptable for American citizens to look at their next door neighbors and say, I want to live next to people who I have something in common with.
We're standing here in Diversity Plaza, which in many ways embodies a very different America, the very one that he's criticizing there. I wondered if you could comment on the vice president's remarks and the America that you're defending.
These remarks, this language from the vice president of this country, it betrays so much of the promise that we have as a nation. And I stand here in Diversity Plaza proud to be an immigrant New Yorker, proud to call this borough my home, a borough where there are more languages spoken than most cities in the world, and proud to be on the precipice of becoming the first immigrant mayor of this city in generations. Yeah. And the fact that the vice president would view someone speaking a different language in this country as something that should be avoided, as something that could be pushed out of our reality. It is so emblematic of the politics that we are trying to show a contrast to, a politics that has room for each and every person that calls the city home.
Now, in the course of a whole week in New York City, I didn't see a single Andrew Cuomo sign. And I did look, but I saw shows of support for the Democratic Party nominee, Zohran Mamdani. They were everywhere. They were easily spotted. I saw in the corners of shop windows and restaurants little smiling Zohran posters. I saw people on the subway with their Zohran buttons. Now, I'm not going to say that the city was exactly abuzz with excitement for the mayor's race. It wasn't the talk of the town or anything. I didn't overhear many people talking about the election. And the one time I thought I heard people talking about the election, there was an argument between a middle-aged black woman and an older white man. I thought that it was a passionate discussion of mayoral politics, and then they turned out to be debating whether it is legal to patent a fungus. So they weren't talking about politics at all. But I did speak with a lot of people while I was there, and they were filled with hope for Mandani. They really felt like he had rejuvenated their faith that better things in politics are possible. Well, they also tended to be a little nervous because they understood the moment Mamdani gets into office, he's not only going to face the combined hostility of the wealthiest people in New York City, but also the wrath of the President of the United States, who has already promised to withhold federal money from New York City if the communist Zohran Mamdani is elected, which of course he has now been. Nevertheless, I saw plenty of signs that people really feel good about Mamdani's victory, and they're very excited for what comes next. Actually, after the midnight press conference, an older black man stuck around, and he was shouting over and over, "Mamdani will unite the city! Mamdani will unite the city!" And a lot of people seem to share that enthusiasm, even if they didn't shout it aloud. So now the question is whether Mamdani can actually govern. If his administration is anything like his campaign, it should be competent, despite his lack of executive experience. I think Mamdani and the people around him are under no illusions about the obstacles that they face. I'm sure I don't need to tell them that FDR really should be the model here. And you can read an article I did recently at Current Affairs about the New Deal and FDR and that kind of democratic politics. And one of the insights there is, importantly, FDR was wildly popular even as he struggled to solve the most important crisis facing the country, which was the Great Depression. And the reason he stayed popular, despite that struggle, was because he stayed in touch with the people, he communicated to them that he was constantly fighting for them, and he was visibly taking steps to alleviate their pain. Now, I hope that Mamdani doesn't make the mistake that Barack Obama did. Obama disbanded his organizing apparatus after he got elected. And I hope Mamdani doesn't do that. Instead, I hope he continues to constantly engage and mobilize the public. Of course, in Obama's case, that wasn't exactly a mistake, since it was in part a product of his technocratic ideology, which suggests that a few enlightened experts should rule and the people are there to get you into office. Now, the good news here is that the history of socialist mayors in the United States shows that it is actually possible for them to succeed. I mentioned Daniel Hone. He's one of the best mayors in the history of Milwaukee, is what he's considered. And he was elected over and over again, having focused on rooting out corruption, establishing public buses, and keeping up the quality of city parks and public schools. Now, he didn't exactly overturn the basic economic order, but he did show that socialist principles are compatible with competent, honest government. And likewise, when Bernie Sanders was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, he's actually regarded as having been a pretty capable and effective mayor who really delivered for people. He certainly didn't destroy the city, although there were plenty of people, even in that case, making the same kinds of warnings that they did about Mamdani. So Mamdani faces an immense challenge now, because after 10 years of insisting that if we on the left are handed power, we could deliver for people, we don't want to be like the dog who caught the car and then didn't know what to do with it. Many eyes are now on Mamdani to see what he's going to do next, whether he's going to crash and burn, whether he's going to sell out, or whether he's going to provide evidence that democratic socialism is in fact the politics America needs. And if Zohran Mamdani defies the skeptics, defies the haters, and if he's the best mayor in the history of New York City, delivering on his agenda, well, then he may massively improve the political fortunes of the American left. But if, on the other hand, he disappoints, he may discredit the left, and he may make it impossible to get socialists elected into office in the future. And so I hope that Zohran Mamdani and his team know what they're doing. But if they govern as well as they campaigned, I would say that New York City is now in pretty good hands. Now, for the last 10 years since we were founded in 2015, Current Affairs has been relentlessly making the argument that democratic socialist politics can win and that they need to be given a chance. Well, now we have that chance. It's probably the most exciting moment in the history of the US left. But that means that the pressure is on and the fight is just beginning. But this victory, Zohran Mamdani becoming the mayor of New York City, this is incredible. And I think the hard-working New Yorkers who made this possible, they have a lot to be proud of. I'd like to thank Abby Andrew for sending in our new teleprompter. If you've noticed that I'm looking more into the camera than before, it is because Abby looked at my videos and said, "Why are you always looking slightly off screen?" And I said, "It's because we don't have a teleprompter." And she said, "If I send you a teleprompter, will you look into the camera at last?" And I said, I'll try. So she sent us an amazing teleprompter, and I've just tried it out on this video. So thank you, Abby.